Cannabis used to be considered a gateway drug to illegal drug usage, but that stigma has been somewhat alleviated. Cannabis was made legal in Canada in 2018, but how did this happen, and what's the impact? How do people think about it?
You know, it makes it easier to get, because let's be real, a lot of people were still doing it even though it was illegal. So I just think, you know, it keeps innocent people out of jail for doing something that's not even that bad, really.
Canada has legislation that allows you to decriminalize it and make it legal for you to use for recreational purposes, whereas in India it's still considered illicit, a controlled substance, and because of that it's very much illegal and carries heavy penalties, probably because of cultural considerations. First of all, cannabis is used intensely in certain parts of the religion. So Hinduism has a sect of religion which uses cannabis as a offering to the Lord of Destruction, Lord Shiva. And with that offering, it's said that because he is the god of destruction, he can handle any kind of toxin, poison, and so it's offered as a spiritual kind of, I guess you could say, observation. But the stigma with recreational use is definitely there. It's considered equivalent to any sort of addiction, and addictions are seen as very bad. I'd say it might be more stringent or more strict in Pakistan because of the heavy Muslim culture and the Muslim influence, because they have a more puritanical or Puritan kind of views with respect to intoxication, complete abstinence from any and all forms. I believe that in itself would make it a little bit more strict.
Everyone has their own thoughts on cannabis legalization. There's no wrong or right answer. The main point is how the government deals with this.
So the reasons why I wanted to go learn about cannabis was because I had been using it for a while. And everyone thought it's bad for you and all my problems are due to using cannabis. And I knew that there's more to it, so I really just wanted to learn. You know, with a background in science, I need to feed my curiosity at all times, and I've always wanted to, when I find something, I like to learn everything about it. So before legalization, I think mostly I was more scared. I just didn't feel as comfortable using in public or admitting to using cannabis. I think the people close to me, so my parents, my family, my friends, I think that it was them, their perception has changed. Sometimes I forget that there are still people who are against it. I am lucky that I've surrounded myself with people who understand the benefits of cannabis. Cannabis industry is very male dominated. So even just walking into any single cannabis business, you're walking into a little bit of bro vibes. Most places, not everywhere. And you know, I work at a dispensary. When I was working at a dispensary, a customer would say, you know, they'd come in, ask for weed, I'd sell it to them. But do you even smoke weed? I'm like, yes. So there's definitely the perception that if you look a certain way, you're unlikely or you shouldn't. Your life's gonna be ruined, kind of thing. I don't have exact numbers, but what I can tell you is that that's something I look for. So when I read a study, I look at the composition of the study participants. And that's something also that gets discussed a lot in presentations. So we are aware of it, the distribution of age, of gender, and even how many transgender people you have participating.
When cannabis is illegal, the entire market is controlled by dealers and criminal networks. Legalization allows the government to regulate and weaken the black market, reducing crime and related violence. Also, it helps the government to control the quality of cannabis and have age restrictions, ensuring people's safety.
So for cannabis, like I work at a dispensary. In terms of like background, like I've been in the dispensaries for a while. I started in around, I believe, 2020, which was just like 2 years after legalization and we officially got dispensaries. So through working at the dispensary, that's where I got a lot of my knowledge from. I have my own personal knowledge just from my own personal consumption of marijuana, but working in the dispensaries, they force us to learn a lot and do a lot of like product knowledge and training, because technically we are dealing with like a substance, so we need to have the correct information when we're talking to people. I think in general, I always believed like marijuana use was kind of like for medicinal purposes, and that like that's kind of why it got shunned, is because people were using it recreationally. But there's definitely a long history of like marijuana being used for medical purposes. And I don't know just I don't just know that from like my own personal consumption. I also know that through work. Like that's something that they teach us, like the history behind it and how it started. But even in my own household, like both my parents smoke, so I kind of like witnessed it growing up, and I feel like maybe that's why I was a little more susceptible to start smoking, especially at like a young age. I think I started smoking when I was like 13, 14. Like it's not good, but at the same time, like it's kind of just what I grew up around in my household. I'm half Jamaican and I'm half Bajan, so I feel like and over there it's not as frowned upon because to them they look at marijuana as like a plant that God put there. It's mainly used to just kind of like people smoke it, calm down, and then they kind of like promote peace, especially in a place like Jamaica where there's like in some areas there's a lot of violence. I feel like for females, a lot of like they try to say that a lot of girls who smoke weed are like rough around the edges, or like, you know, we don't really have much going for us, we're kind of lazy, we don't really do anything, weed makes you stay in bed, you kind of just like want to hang out and smoke weed all day, which isn't true. Like there are a lot of women out there like myself who smoke weed and are high functioning members of society. Not only do I smoke weed, I work full-time hours at my job, and then I come to school full-time as well. So I would definitely want to put that to rest for marijuana and women. For men, I think a lot of the misconception is that like a man who smokes weed is, most of all, I think when people think man who smokes weed, they think a black person, and on top of that they probably think someone who is rough around the edges, probably involved in a lot of crime, just out on the streets hanging out, which isn't true either. There are a lot of men who smoke weed of all different races, all different religions as well, and they're also all high-functioning members of society. And I see it at my job. I see men in suits come in, I see men in tracksuits come in, but I see it from A to Z. I see every type of person come in.
You know what? Everyone has their own preference of drug choices, but I do see sometimes marijuana could be a gateway to you know, all these other drugs, right? But each to their own, right? No, because caffeine is a drug, right? But like it doesn't have much of a psychological effect as cannabis would, right? But however, when it comes to other drugs, it is worse. So like, you know, cannabis is like in the less harmful list, so it shouldn't really be worried about. As a cannabis user, I'm actually quite happy with the legalization because I see it doing more good than harm. What I do notice is, you know, the government is making a lot of money off cannabis. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Um, for example, alcohol is legal, right? And you know, like driving a car, it all requires having a sense of responsibility, right? If you're responsible with that particular substance, there shouldn't be any issues. But on the other hand, what I notice is, you know, particularly me, I started at a very young age, at an age where, you know, it wasn't legal, right? So I noticed how me starting at a young age did have some negative effects on me. You know, it introduced me to, you know, other substances and, you know, made me make some really bad choices. But I do also see it as a good use in the medical industry. For example, people with Alzheimer's and like, you know, cancer. I see, you know, they use it and they have a drastic change, a very positive change from using cannabis. And also, you guys need to take another thing into account. So there's two types of marijuana. Like, I guess there's two types of bud. There's CBD and there's THC. So THC is, you know, it's the substance that gets you, you know, high in. But CBD is what is particularly used for medicinal purposes. It doesn't give you a high, but even before marijuana, there was a drug problem in Canada, right? So like, particularly crack, cocaine, fentanyl. Those are the main problems right now. Because if you guys see on the streets, like people are dying from taking those drugs, right?
With cannabis, depending on how much you inhale, the number of puffs, all sorts of stuff can do it. But yeah, something. I mean, especially if it's high concentration cannabis every day, it's really can be a medical problem and can be an issue. Yeah, it's again, it's like our drugs. When people abuse it, we have problems. The same thing with alcohol. You know, people drinking alcohol every day at lunch. You know, a couple bottles of that wine. Yeah, it's again because with cigarettes, it's basically a pack of cigarettes a day. So that's 20 cigarettes. And it's basically you take 10 inhalations of the cigarette to get the dose of nicotine. So that's about 200 puffs a day. When you're talking about cannabis, usually if people are just doing one joint, it's maybe 4 or 5 or 6 puffs a day. That's it. So they're not being exposed to that. It doesn't seem to be as carcinogenic. Like either the cannabinoids in there reduce the carcinogenicity somewhat or whatever. Like I wouldn't want people smoking much of it, of anything, or abusing any of these drugs. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like I've been looking.
Okay, so we have an alternate to it. It's called, but it's similar to cannabis, like weed, and yeah, people a certain area in our country, the people from there, they use it a lot. But I would say not stigma, but it's also from a religious perspective that something that makes your mind blurry and you don't know then what you do. It can be something you can hurt someone or something. So that's why it's mostly not liked by many. For me, if you consider me, as long as they don't do an overdose, they are in their senses, they know how they are dressing up and everything. As long as it's that, I think it's fine. But the moment they lose their control over the senses, and then they start acting awkward or weird, I would say.
I think most of the young population are happy, if I'm being honest, because in Pakistan there is a big restriction still. There's no open smoking law in Pakistan. So most of the people that live here that are from Pakistan, they were quite happy, honestly, if you ask me. But older people, they like, if I tell my parents that I smoke marijuana, they would be very upset, right? So their perspective of the ban is it's still the same, that it should not happen. Like, we should not promote drugs or anything like that, and government should put, but that's their point of view. And I mean, a lot of guys that I know that grew up in Pakistan and they came here, they're quite into smoking stuff like that, recreationally and even medicinally. I think we have to look at the reasons why it was legalized. I mean, the main objective out of it was that the government wanted to subsidize all the marijuana that was being produced so that there was less street drugs. And I think a lot of people talk about that it shouldn't have been illegalized, because being legalized, there's a certain restrictions, right? You cannot have more than a certain amount of weed, and you cannot grow a certain amount of marijuana in the backyard. I don't think it does put more restrictions, honestly, because they still go out and smoke. And I mean, restrictions are not, I mean, it's just that they wanted to make, I mean, I don't want to go more critical into it, why government wanted to legalize this, right? Because if you look at it, there's always a backstory to it, and there is a backstory to it. They wanted to get rid of all the money that was being distributed on streets. They wanted to keep it to themselves. So legalizing it was one way of doing that, but honestly, it's still going on. We still see a lot of street dealers out there, and we still see a lot of youth going into selling weed nowadays. It's very common, especially now I see, because a lot of people that I grew up with, the average is staggering. At least 4 people that I grew up with in high school, they regularly deal marijuana. And this is coming from someone that, I've worked in the medical as well. So I see a lot of these young kids using, they have chronic issues as well, right? So they also use it medicinally and recreationally. But, I don't think it has had any effect on the population, the ban.
Marijuana has helped a lot of people. So before you think twice about the smell you smell in the air, or when you see people smoking weed, remember that for some people, it's a difference between life and death for them. It's the difference between getting out of bed and not getting out of bed, because they were able to have an edible today and they were able to get up and not have knee pain and walk around and have a good day.